So we've arrived at the threshold of Proposition 16 in Book 1 of the Ethics. Let me just summarize briefly how we got here. Spinoza has given us an abstract idea, an abstract definition of God as something that has absolutely infinitely many attributes, each of which is infinite in its own kind. In a word, Spinoza's God is maximal in every respect. And in Proposition 11, he has given us an ontological argument, an argument from this definition that purports to show that God, as he defines it, exists. So because it's an ontological argument, the claim is that the existence is necessary. The proof in Proposition 11 requires that God have infinitely many attributes, although he only mentions two of them. In Proposition 14, he mentions the attributes of thought and extension for the first time and says that these are the only two attributes which are accessible to us. Attributes are said to express or to constitute God's essence, and the attributes of thought and extension, then it is claimed, will express the same essence, one and the same essence, despite the apparent difference. This anomaly is only going to be explained in Book 2, Proposition 7 of Book 2, which states that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. Ideas are the modes of substance or of God under the attribute of thought, and particular things or bodies are the modes of substance under the attribute of extension, and the parallelism of the attributes, the one-to-one correspondence between ideas and things, explains how God can have these two apparently different attributes of extension and thought. For Spinoza, these are just two ways of looking at the same thing. This philosophical position is known as dual aspect monism, and it's intended as an answer to Descartes' substance dualism. Okay, the idea that there are independently existing realms, one material, another immaterial. For Spinoza, extension and thought are just two different ways of looking at one and the same thing, that one substance which he calls God. So propositions 16 and 17 foreshadow the development in the rest of Book 1, particularly from about Proposition 29 to the end. It's they are important, but rather difficult to follow without knowing where Spinoza is going. So I will just present these propositions and their scholia by pointing to the statements that Spinoza will make later that enhance and sharpen the assertions that he is making at this stage. Proposition 16 says that from the necessity of the divine nature must follow an infinite number of things in infinite ways. That is, all things which can fall within the sphere of an infinite intellect. So notice that the way he is interpreting the word infinite to mean everything that is possible. Okay, not merely an unbounded set, but a set which which contains everything possible. And this is a foreshadowing of Proposition 35, which states roughly that God creates everything that is within his power. All possibilities are realized. This is sometimes known as the principle of plenitude. And the argument that he offers, I think, can be glossed very simply. It says that if God is maximal in every possible respect, there are no unrealized, unactualized possibilities. It follows from the necessity of God's nature that an infinite number of things necessarily follows. And note the emphasis on the word necessity. Okay, this is foreshadowing Spinoza's necessitarianism, the idea that nothing could possibly be other than it actually is. Not only are all possibilities realized, but all possibilities are necessarily realized. As Spinoza says elsewhere, God acts by the same necessity whereby he exists. The first corollary says that God is the efficient cause of all that can fall within the sphere of an infinite intellect. This implicitly is a reference to Aristotelian physics. It was the great achievement of the scientific revolution of the 17th century to do away with Aristotle's four notions of causality, particularly the notion of a final cause, teleology. Spinoza spends a great deal of time in the appendix of Book 1 to demolishing this idea of teleology, final causes. The only cause that, or the only type of causation that Spinoza recognizes is mechanical or efficient causation. So God, for Spinoza, is the efficient cause of all that can fall within the sphere of an infinite intellect. Everything is necessitated by God. It also follows that God is a cause in himself and not through an accident of his nature. God necessarily exists and acts by the same necessity. There is no room for accident. It follows thirdly that God is the absolutely first cause. Proposition 17 says that God acts solely by the laws of his own nature and is not constrained by anyone. And the gist of the proof is simply that God, by definition, being maximal, there is nothing that can exist outside of God which could condition or constrain God to act in one way or another. And in particular, this means there's no principle, okay? There can be no external cause, nothing acting on God extrinsically, besides the perfection of his own nature that moves God to act. So we'll see later, this is preparing the ground for what appears to be a swipe at Leibniz, okay, that Leibniz maintained that God acted so as to create the best of all possible worlds, so positing a principle of goodness external to God, whereas for Spinoza, everything follows of necessity from the divine nature. Corollary 2 states that God is the sole free cause. In the definition of free at the beginning of Book 1, there are two parts. One says that God is, or to be a free cause requires one, that one is a cause of oneself, and secondly, that one acts by the sole necessity of one's nature. So God is the sole free cause, the only thing that satisfies both requirements in this definition. There is a notion of freedom that pertains to the modes of substance, to particular things, to the extent that they have the ability to act in accordance with the laws of their nature. Okay, Spinoza will call them free. And this is the type of freedom that he holds out as a possibility for man. Okay, he now goes into a lengthy scholium, which will not be fully explicated until later in part one, from about proposition 29 onwards. But he goes on to explain that when he says that God is a free cause, he does not mean to say that God acts by freedom of the will. He will explicitly rule this out in a corollary to proposition 32. If I remember correctly, he's saying that God is a free cause in the sense that he's not constrained by anything. So the idea that God is free to choose to create one thing rather than another, Spinoza has rejected, because according to Spinoza, God creates everything conceivable. And he argues that this is a better account of God's omnipotence than the traditional one. He also mentions that he's going to show that neither will nor intellect appertain to God's nature. Let me come back to that one later. Returning to this theme, the popular belief that God is supremely intelligent, yet people do not believe that he can bring into existence everything which he actually understands. That's what Spinoza is objecting to, and saying, quoting Proposition 16, I think I have shown sufficiently clearly that from God's supreme power or infinite nature, an infinite number of things, that is, all things, have necessarily flowed forth in an infinite number of ways, or always flow from the same necessity. In the same way as from the nature of a triangle, it follows from eternity and for eternity that its three interior angles are equal to two right angles. So this is the first full-throated statement of Spinoza's necessitarianism. And he will iterate this several times. Okay, he will say in Proposition 29 that nothing in nature is contingent. Everything is necessary. In Proposition 33, that things could not have been brought into being by God in any order or in any manner other than that which has in fact obtained. So he's going to develop these ideas more sharply in the sequence of propositions from 29 to 36, the end of book one. Coming back to this question about will and intellect, the traditional doctrine for the medievals, the doctrine of divine simplicity, held that there were four attributes of God involved in the creation: will, intellect, life or existence, and power. Spinoza is going to say that God's existence and God's power pertain to his essence, but that God's will and God's intellect belong to the system of modes. They are modes of substance rather than attributes. So again, this is going to be explained at greater length in the propositions at the end of book one. And eventually at the end of book two, he's actually going to say that will and intellect are one and the same thing. But it would be getting ahead of ourselves to talk about that at any greater length at this point. Okay, now we encounter a few more theological propositions. Proposition 18 states that God is the indwelling and not the transient cause of all things. Sometimes this proposition is rendered as God is the immanent and not the transitive cause of all things. This appears to refer to a scholastic distinction. An immanent cause is a cause which is manifest in the effect. So this is just another way of affirming the idea that all things are necessitated by God. God is the efficient cause of all particular things. God is the immanent cause of all particular things. Proposition 19, God and all the attributes of God are eternal. The definition of eternal is its definition 8 at the beginning of book one, and it simply means necessary existence. And the attributes of God are expressions or that which constitute the essence of God. And the necessary existence is just the substance of his proof of God's existence, the ontological proof that purports to show that the definition of God, God's essence necessitates God's existence. So proposition 20 just states that the existence of God and his essence are one and the same. So God's existence or God's life does pertain to the essence of God. And Spinoza will also say that God's power pertains to the essence of God, but not God's intellect or God's will, which he says belongs to the system of modes. God's existence, like his essence, is an eternal truth. An eternal truth is just a necessary truth. The attributes of God are unchangeable. He referred to that in the proof of the following proposition. There's a change in direction at this point. Proposition 21 is the first proposition concerning the modes. Remember, the um, there are substance and modes of substance. Modes are modifications or affections of substance, which is to say particular things under the attribute of extension, or ideas under the attribute of thought. And he sketches um, um, a theory, or a sort of theory of emanationism, how the modes are supposed to emerge from the attributes. So up until this point, he has only been talking about the attributes of God, and in Proposition 21 and in succeeding propositions, he will talk about the system of modes, all of which for Spinoza is governed by causal determinism. Proposition 21 refers to what the commentators call the immediate infinite modes. The immediate modes are those which are supposed to follow directly from the attributes of God, and they're known as the infinite modes because the claim of the proposition is that these um, immediate modes must always exist and be infinite. So he, for the purposes of the proof, he focuses on the immediate mode in the attribute of thought, which he calls the God, the idea of God, God's idea of himself. He will later refer to this as the infinite intellect of God. But the point of this proposition is to demonstrate that it is indeed infinite. There is one immediate mode in the attribute of extension, and he calls that motion and rest. That's not actually referred to here. So the gist of the proof, as insofar as I understand it, is that if God's idea of himself were not infinite, if that would mean that there is another idea which bounds or limits God's idea of itself, and that would have to, since all that there is God, this putative other idea would have to be an idea of God, and that's a contradiction. It's up to you whether you think this argument is worth exploring in any greater detail. He claims that he also claims that this idea of God must exist unchanged, must therefore be everlasting, and that this is a consequence of the fact that the attributes of God, he said in Corollary 2 to the previous proposition, that the attributes of God, being eternal, necessarily existing, are unchangeable. So if at one time the attribute gave rise to the idea of God's idea of himself, the idea of God, it must do so at all times. I don't think there's much more that can be said about this. Spinoza's account of the modes, which occupies the several propositions following Proposition 21, is extremely sketchy. And I don't think, at least in my reading, it's not of fundamental importance for understanding his thought.